Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jason Cogdell, and I'm one of two benefits attorneys at ProBenefits, and this is our annual Attendee Choice webinar. What we do each year at the end of the third quarter is to send out a short voting survey to everyone that's attended a live session within the year, in this case 2018, in the first 9 months worth of webinars. And thank you to you all for an enthusiastic response and voting for the topic. There were several different options, and as listed on the screen, this topic, benefit plan notices, what is required and when, ultimately was the winner with over a third of the vote. But there was a lot of interest in the other four topics, so we'll certainly consider that for the upcoming sessions, both the last 2 months of 2018, and traditionally in December we do an end of the year and then look ahead to next year compliance updates. So that's probably what we'll do, and wrap in some of the status of the ACA as part of that session in December, and we'll take this feedback into account for our planning for 2019 as well. But thank you for your great response, and of those of you, the large number of you who responded and voted, 5 of you were selected to receive an Amazon gift card, and those of you that were selected will receive that by email sometime today. So thanks for your good response. The topic that we landed on, again, is employee benefit notices. What is required for an employer to provide to employees or participants, and when? And this is somewhat of a challenging topic because, unfortunately, and despite what we would like, this is not a one-size-fits-all. And a common request that Laura and I get, and if you're an advisor out there, you probably get this request as well from employers of various sizes, is, can you send us a list of everything we're required to provide to employees? Well, there are lists out there, and I'll show you some examples today, and I'm going to give you 3 different resource options, one of which may be most helpful to you depending on what organization you work with and your personal preferences. There are good resources out there. However, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. For example, some employers don't sponsor a group health plan. They have other benefits. Well, that would drastically reduce the number of notices or distributions that an employer would need to make. There are differences, albeit small, between large employers and small employers because, for example, FMLA doesn't apply to small employers. So a formal FMLA notice upon hire or posting at the job site, or a notice upon the start of FMLA leave, would not be required for a small employer. There are other examples, and I'll get to some specific examples as we go. But it all boils down to, what plans does the employer sponsor? And that's why it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And even the best and most comprehensive list of required notices, again, I'll show you examples today and give you 3 options, one of which hopefully will be helpful to you, will not be perfectly on all fours with every single plan, even a large employer plan or an employer that sponsors all benefits. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. If it were, that would be certainly easier for all of us. I would certainly, as an advisor, prefer that method. That's just not what it is. So as we put this in context, the employer generally is the plan sponsor. So we got the plan sponsor who is in charge of the plan. The plan has certain obligations, the first and most important of which is to administer the plan exactly as it says in writing. The plan administrator is charged on behalf of the plan sponsor with administering the plan exactly as it is in writing, in compliance with the law. And most of the time we're talking about federal law when it comes to employee benefit plans. There are 3 methods by which the employer and the plan sponsor, again, the plan administrator by extension, can fulfill its obligations to not only administer the plan correctly, but provide notices that are required. And specifically, the term of art is disclosure, that not only does the plan have to be administered the way it's written, but plan participants, and in some cases, employees that aren't even plan participants, have to be given notice, and the rights that they may have under the benefit plans or under federal law must be disclosed to those participants. So again, the big picture is this: The plan has to provide certain disclosures to participants or employees, and there are 3 methods to do it as listed on the 3rd bullet point on the slide. The first and most important of which, the SPD, Summary Plan Description, is required by ERISA for all health and welfare benefit plans sponsored by an employer. And then there are also some SPD requirements for IRS plans that are not already subject to ERISA. But the SPD, the plan in writing disclosed to participants, is the most important disclosure. Not only is the SPD one of the disclosure requirements and the most important notice for any plan, but also the SPD will include a number of items that are required notices so that the employer doesn't have to separately provide those notices. So that's a big deal. So we got SPD number 1, the most important by far. Second, we got the SBC, Summary of Benefits and Coverage, which is new under ACA and has only been around now for 4 or 5 years. The SBC only applies to health plans that the ACA governs, and it's basically a condensed summary of rights that participants have under a health plan, and it's an annual requirement. So SBC is the second method that employer fulfills its disclosure requirements, but that is specific to health plans only. SPD, Summary Plan Descriptions, apply to all ERISA plans or IRS tax benefit plans. If the employer has to provide notice of a right or an option under a benefit plan, and it's not included in the SPD or the SBC, then it would be a separate standalone notice that the employer would independently provide on a one-by-one basis or grouped with other notices, either in hard copy or electronically. And I'll talk about electronic distribution at the end of the presentation. But these are notices that the employer has to provide, and since they're not in an SPD and they're not in an SBC, the employer has to provide it as a standalone notice. By the way, a common question, are these notices that can just be posted in the break room? Everybody loves the posted in the break room, even though the break room is a concept that's outdated at many employers, particularly with employers that have remote employees or many separate locations and different types of offices. The old posting in the break room notice method is largely outdated. It does still work for certain things. For example, certain state requirements are required to be posted at the employer. Workers' compensation notice would be one example. And there are even some federal requirements such as the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, or the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, ADEA, that are allowed to be posted at the employer's place of business and don't have to necessarily be separately given to employees. But for the most part, let's assume as a general rule, these notices must be individually given to employees, either in hard copy or electronically, and that these are not notices that we're talking about using the posting in the break room method. Now, since it's not a one-size-fits-all, that explains why those of you on the session today, whether you're an employer or an advisor, may or may not have a great reference at your fingertips for employers to use. In my work, I use 3 different options, and I'm going to show you all 3 options. If you want any of these 3, we'll be happy to share them with you, and all you need to do is when you get the email in follow-up to the webinar, which will include a link to this presentation. These slides are not a big deal, but just a link to the presentation and a couple of other items of relevance. You're welcome to just respond and say, I'd like number 1, number 2, or number 3, and we'll be happy to provide that to you. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is just go through these 3 options and show you some examples, and hopefully you can identify whether this may be helpful or not to you. The first option, I'm going to wait for that to pop up on the slide here. This is the Department of Labor's annual reporting and disclosure guide for employee benefit plans. This is a 30-page PDF. It's actually online. You can Google DOL disclosure guide and it'll be the first link that pops up. So this is from the DOL's website. I have downloaded it as a PDF document, but this is something everyone has access to. The good news is that this is very comprehensive. It's an excellent resource. And frankly, from a compliance perspective, where better to rely on information from than the source? In this case, the United States Department of Labor, which governs ERISA and other aspects of federal benefits law. Again, this is a 30-page document. I'll just start flipping through it here. This one was updated in September of 2017 for the 2018 plan year. And as you'll see, there's a chart, and the entirety of the document is a chart of different specific disclosure requirements for employer benefit plans to provide to participants if they apply. So the good news is this is a comprehensive list. The bad news is there's a lot of information here, although it is well presented in terms of a chart, and I like the chart. And some of the aspects in this document will not be applicable to all plans. Also, this document, one reason it's so long and comprehensive is that it does include both health and welfare plans and retirement plans. For the most part, we as employers, and I, in addition to being an advisor, I do represent a small employer. Our company has 35 employees, and we sponsor a retirement plan in addition to our health and welfare benefit plans. The good news is that for most of us, whether small or large, we are paying a retirement plan administrator, in our case a 401k administrator, that assists us with the annual notices and the various requirements for the retirement plan. So most of the time I'm only concerning myself with the notices for health and welfare plans, and that's the case for many employers. This document includes everything, because ERISA does apply to both retirement plans and health and welfare plans. I'll just continue to flip through, and you'll see this back to the first page of the chart. SPD is on that list. Plan documents, notice of adverse claim determinations, Cobra notices, and there are a number of required Cobra notices. By the way, we're a Cobra administrator, so we're very familiar with both the required and the optional notices for Cobra. This document does include the required Cobra notices, so that's good. And I'll continue flipping down here, and you'll see that some of these are applicable to all, and some of them are not. SBC is listed at the top of this page. I'm just going to keep flipping through. As we get here to sections 2 and 3, we get into some of the documents that are specific to retirement plan. So if I'm using this DOL disclosure guide, I've printed it out most likely, or I've got it in a PDF on my system that I can update. I'm going to highlight what we need to follow and somehow mark what we don't, since there is a lot of information in this chart. I'll keep flipping through here, and you'll see the majority of the items listed here in the back half of the document are for retirement plans and pension plans. So going back to the top, again, good news is this is straight from the source. I like the chart format. It's very helpful, particularly to an employer that doesn't know where to start and has got to find a starting point. This is a good resource. So this is the DOL Notice and Disclosure Guide, Reporting and Disclosure Guide for Benefit Plans is option number 1. For those that instead of this type of document and the chart would like a little more explanation of what's required, when is it required, this is an example of a good reference document. Our most trusted legal reference resource is an organization called EBIA, in which we participate and have been partners for a long time, and the resources from EBIA are outstanding. They've got some really talented folks that do research and writing for them, and it's a group that we have a lot of confidence and trust in, and we're willing to pay a lot of money for their resources. In EBIA, the way that they break it down is this is a roughly 20-page reference document, of which there's an introduction of what employers need to do, and then this is the way they break it down, similar to my summary. We've got SPD disclosures that are required, SBC disclosures that are required, and then other disclosures that are required. So it actually goes through and lists them. This is in text format, very good explanations on the different items. I'm just going to keep scrolling through to the next heading. All those are SPD disclosures, by the way. Then we get to SBC disclosures. You'll see there's a chart of SBC disclosures. And then finally, and the reason I'm showing you this is very helpful. There's a checklist of the specific independent disclosures and notices that are required by an employer that are generally not in SBCs or SPDs. And this is very helpful. And in this case, it lists them all out, what it is, when it may apply, because a lot of the independent notices don't necessarily have to be provided to everyone until a specific event occurs. And that's the way that this chart is done. And it's very good. I'm going to show you an example here. Here's an example. As context, the Affordable Care Act added certain disclosures and notices for group health plans to provide to participants. One of those is a grandfathered plan notice, that if an employer sponsors a plan that's grandfathered, meaning the plan hasn't changed significantly since March 23rd, 2010, when the ACA was implemented, and so the plan doesn't have to follow certain ACA rules, that plan has to provide a grandfathered plan notice each year at or after enrollment. Another ACA requirement is that the health plans must provide a notice to participants, of the certain protections, their right to designate their own primary care provider, their right to have preventive services at no cost to the participant. Those requirements are listed here on this page. For example, at the top, patient protections, written notice of the right to designate a primary care provider. That's for the most part included in summary plan descriptions, but if it's not in an SPD, the employer would want to provide that as a standalone notice. Same thing with the grandfathered plan, which is usually not in an SPD. That would be one example. Here's the FMLA notice, and a long, extensive explanation of what is required for an FMLA notice, again, for an employer that is subject to FMLA. The general notice, which the old break room method would work, and then the specific notice of eligibility when an FMLA situation arises and the employee has FMLA rights for job and coverage continuation during the leave up to 12 weeks. This is what explains that, what notice is required and when from the employer. So this is option 2. Back to the slide. This is the reference document with a breakdown of SPD, SBC, and then the separate notices. And I think this is well done from EBA. So again, option 1, the DOL reporting and disclosure guide. Some people really prefer that. This reference document number 2, or option 3, a list. Again, common question: do you have a list? Well, there are lists out there, and I've seen some good ones and some bad ones. This is the current version of our list, which I've recently split into different categories. I had them separately listed, and I've recently reorganized them based on when they must be provided. So here are the categories that are included here. First, upon hire. What do we have to provide to an employee upon hire, regardless of whether they're eligible yet or they enroll in a benefits plan? Example: the FLSA notice. FLSA is Fair Labor Standards Act. The FLSA notice about the health insurance marketplace. We have to provide that to all new hires within 14 days. So that's kind of a general notice. There's an FMLA general notice I mentioned. And it's also best practice, even though not legally required, it's a best practice that the employer provide either notice of FMLA rights or its own leave of absence policy, whether a large or small employer subject to FMLA. It makes available to new hires. A lot of employers do that in an employee handbook, but regardless of the format, it's a best practice to provide those to employees upon hire, so that their basic rights of employment are either known or accessible to them as soon as they are hired. But you may or may not be surprised to know that most of these other notices are not required to be provided upon hire, not in the new hire packet. They don't have to be handed out during orientation. They will then be triggered by either A, enrollment in a plan, B, annual notices, most of which are provided around the time of annual open enrollment, or upon a specific event. So that's the way this list is broken down: new hire, initial enrollment or eligibility, annual requirements, and then specific event requirements. The items that are in italics are listed in italics because most of the time those items are in an SPD, and so the employer doesn't have to provide a separate notice if they're in the SPD. The notice requirement has been fulfilled. That's the reason for the italics. the reason for the items marked in red is simply because I'm going to use those as examples. An example of a notice that would be provided upon enrollment in a benefit plan is a notice of HIPAA special enrollment rights that says not only you as the employee are eligible, but if you don't enroll now, when may you be able to enroll, such as the occurrence of a special enrollment event, birth of a child would be an example of one of those HIPAA special enrollment events. Generally speaking, HIPAA special enrollment events are listed either in the plan SPD or in the IRS Section 125 cafeteria plan SPD, which also governs qualifying events that are allowed under Section 125. So most of the time, the employer doesn't have to provide a specific document of HIPAA special enrollment rights, but it is something that once the individual enrolls in a plan, he or she must be given notice of, enrolls or becomes eligible for a plan. And you'll see those other initial enrollment or eligibility items. The only one that's not in italics and not usually in an SPD is the Cobra initial notice, which is a separate standalone notice that should be part of every employer's practice that is subject to Cobra. If you got more than 20 employees, you're subject to Cobra, you should be providing an initial notice to anyone who enrolls in a plan that would be subject to Cobra continuation if that benefit were terminated. Annual notices, you'll see the list grows a little bit, and only two listed here in italics. So that means that employers, generally speaking, do have requirements to provide annually to individuals that are enrolled in a benefit plan. The first listed there, SBC. No surprise, we're aware of that for group health plans. I mentioned earlier the grandfather plan notice. I mentioned earlier the notice of patient protections. The item listed in red, the Medicare Part D creditable coverage notice. The deadline, actually October 15th, which was yesterday, is the annual deadline for every employer that has plan participants over the age of 65 who are technically eligible to enroll in Medicare, and specifically Medicare Part D for prescription drugs. The employer is required by law to provide a notice to those individuals of whether or not the group health plan coverage is creditable as it relates to Medicare Part D. Some employers struggle with whether their coverage is credible, and sometimes the carriers are helpful and sometimes they're not, telling the employer whether or not the coverage is creditable under the Medicare Part D rules. But this is an annual requirement. The deadline is October 15th. If you're just now remembering that deadline, or if you haven't met that deadline, that's okay. Just, get with your advisor, maybe consider taking care of that notice sometime as soon as you can to ensure that requirement is satisfied. The next two, HIPAA and Women's Health and Cancer Rights Act notice, are both generally included in a plan SPD. By the way, I keep mentioning plan SPD. Many employers just rely on the carrier booklet, the carrier's participant booklet, whether provided in hard copy or more typically posted online by the carrier or the employer. It's always good for the employer to have accessible a copy of the participant booklet to post on its enrollment site if you use an online enrollment and benefits portal for employees, or to have available for employees that need a hard copy rather than accessing it through the carrier site. Many employers just rely on the insurance booklet as the ERISA SPD, and I won't get into all the SPD requirements now. Some employers supplement the carrier booklet with a WRAP SPD or wraparound SPD, which supplements the carrier booklet to make sure that other items that are required by ERISA to be provided in an SPD are available to plan participants. So when I use the phrase SPD, it's whatever the employer is using as the SPD, whether the carrier booklet or the carrier booklet plus a WRAP SPD. And the last two requirements listed there under the annual notices are the summary annual report, which is for only Form 5500 filers that have to give a summary of the 5500 to plan participants within 2 months after the Form 5500 is filed with the DOL. And then HIPAA notices for privacy and security of protected health information. Those of you participating in a health plan may know that sometime during the year we'll get, typically from the carrier, mailed to us or distributed electronically, a notice of privacy practices. And that's a required HIPAA notice for covered entities, and that's something that's an annually required notice. So that's just a quick rundown of annual notices. The next category is upon specific event, meaning that these are notices that are not required until something happens. And then when they happen, that triggers the plan's responsibility, the employer's requirement to distribute certain notices to plan participants that are affected. The ones in red, as an example here, notice of benefit determination. Whether the benefit is approved or the benefit is denied, and triggers the claim denial and an appeal right internally for the participant to the plan service provider or the insurance carrier. And then any subsequent appeals or internal or external review, that's only triggered when there is a benefit determination, positive or negative. And when it's negative, when a claim is denied, let's say for a particular medical procedure or medical device, if the claim is denied, then that triggers certain other responsibilities from the plan. Now, the good news for us plan administrators that are using plan service providers to administer the plan is most of the time the plan service provider is taking care of the benefit determination notice and the claims and appeals information with the participant. That's good news. But for any benefit plans that are self-administered by the employer, these are notices that would be required to be provided. And that's part of the analysis of whether or not self-administration is a good idea, for example. But those two items are only required upon specific event. And again, the big deal is when claims are denied, the notice of denial and the explanation for denial must be given to the participant, and then any option for appeals. And then when the appeal is made, it must be decided within a certain time frame, and the explanation must be again provided to the plan participants. So those are the examples that were listed in red. The Cobra election notice is another example. When a participant in a group health plan or other Cobra eligible benefit loses eligibility, either as a result of termination, reduction of hours, or one of the other Cobra triggering events, the Cobra election notice must be provided to that participant and any other qualified beneficiaries within 44 days. And so that's a big deal. That's why it's at the top of the list there. It's a big deal. And the Cobra election notice is something that the employer's sending it out or it's Cobra administrator sending it out, but it must be done. This is a big deal because there are more significant negative consequences to failing to provide a Cobra election notice than there are for some of these other notices. The last 5 listed there are in italics, and that means that most of the time these notices are taken care of with the summary plan description, SPD, and not required to be separately distributed by the employer. I won't go through each of those. And then finally, the last category, other general or specific notices or postings that the employer may have to provide. I mentioned FMLA earlier, the general notice, ADA, ADEA, USERRA is the leave of absence law for employees or individuals that are participating in the military. These are general notices. They don't have to be in an SPD. They don't have to be provided standalone. They can be generally posted or distributed by the employer. The break room method does work for these items, or the electronic break room method, which I guess is just a general posting on an intranet or a benefits portal. So this is the list. You'll see this is a page and a half. This is by no means the best, most exhaustive resource ever. This is an attempt, one attempt, and it's always in motion and in progress, one attempt or effort at listing the different notices, not to try to cover every scenario, because again, these resources are not one size fits all, but an attempt to simplify and set up in a timeline what notices are required and when. So these are the 3 resources, and as I mentioned, these are available to you. If it would be helpful to you to have 1, 2, or 3, let us know, and we'll be happy to provide that. And in fact, I'll make sure we include in the email follow-up an offer to give you 1, 2, or 3. Again, item 1 is available on a Google search. Items 2 and 3 are not publicly available, so that's something we can make available to you if it will be helpful to you. Now, best practices. And a concluding word here. First, the most important thing with every benefit plan that's subject to ERISA or IRS rules is to make sure that there is an SPD. because not only is the SPD required by law, and that's a big deal, but also providing a compliant SPD to participants either annually or whenever the plan is amended or updated. SPDs are not required to be provided every single year, but only upon enrollment, and then when the plan is updated, the employer has to provide it within 275 days. If the employer complies with the SPD rule, that takes care of other notices. So that's why SPD compliance is far and away the most important thing that an employer can do here to take care of notices. Secondly, and less important, but still important, is that for health plans subject to the ACA, the employer should confirm that there's an SBC. And that is an annual requirement, by the way. If you've got a fully insured plan, the carrier is providing the SBC, so that's great. If it's not a fully insured major medical plan, the carrier may not be providing the SBC. So the plan may separately need to make sure that an SBC is in place for a self-funded health plan or a non-major medical plan or a health reimbursement arrangement or some other health plan that's subject to these rules, but for which a carrier may not be providing the SBC. And then again, beyond the SPD and the SBC, the employer should assess the need for any separate notices that it may be required to provide based on the plans it sponsors and based on its specific plan design and the applicability of some of these notices. And then finally, be ready to respond. This is a little known ERISA rule, is that even though it is required for an employer to have and distribute an SPD to any plan participant, the only financial penalty for failure to distribute is triggered when a plan participant or former participant requests the SPD from the employer and the employer or plan sponsor does not provide it within 30 days. So anytime that a participant requests a document that the participant has a right to have, which is not everything, but these require notices, get it to them ASAP. That's upon a leave of absence, upon a request for an SPD by a current or former participant, or any other information that the participant may need by virtue of the participant's situation or just a general inquiry. The plan sponsor, the plan administrator need to be ready to provide promptly and get that to the individual right away. So those are my list of best practices. What I'm going to do now, I see that we've received a few questions, is I'm going to end the general session. So if you have not submitted a question and you're ready to finish up and log off, thanks for joining us, and you'll get a follow-up email with a link to the recording and an offer for one of the three resources that I mentioned. If you have submitted a question, feel free to hang around for a few minutes. I'm going to answer the questions in writing, both to the person who asked and the others who remain on. So if you've got a question, you're welcome to submit it now through the question box and hang around for a few minutes as I get to yours and others' questions. I'll make sure to reply all on the other ones. Again, thank you for attending today. Hope that you found the session helpful, and I'll stay on for a few minutes for questions. Have a great day.